Good afternoon. We'd like to welcome all of you, faculty, staff, students of UW-Tacoma, members of the general public, and everyone who is invited to attend this afternoon. We'd like to welcome you. We're excited to have you with us this afternoon to attend this Office of Inclusion and Office of Equity and Inclusion, I should say, Coalition for Building Racial Justice event. And we have a very exciting topic this afternoon. And so we're excited that you came with us. White supremacy and cancel culture, countering right-wing attacks on anti-racism work. And we're delighted to have a nationally acclaimed speaker, Ms. Loretta Ross, with us this afternoon. But before we get into the content of our program this afternoon, I'd like to just do a quick overview of our program and what to expect. So we will start off with a brief introduction from Dr. Marianne Harris, who is our Interim Vice Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion in UW-Tacoma. Then after Dr. Harris does the opening remarks and land acknowledgement, we will now invite and introduce our guest speaker, Ms. Loretta Ross. And then Ms. Loretta Ross will give her presentation. And after the presentation, we will have the opportunity for question and answer session. At that point, you could ask your questions and Ms. Ross will be happy to respond to them. And we will wrap up with some closing remarks towards the end of the event this afternoon. So to start us off, I'd like to invite Dr. Marianne Harris, who is our Vice Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion. But let me quickly introduce Dr. Harris, who is a known figure in the UW system. So Dr. Harris is the Interim Vice Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion and a Professor of Social Work and Criminal Justice in the UW-Tacoma. She's also an adjunct professor in the University of Washington Social Work School at Seattle, Washington. Dr. Harris is a nationally and internationally acclaimed scholar and welfare researcher. She's also a social justice advocate. Dr. Harris has received several teaching, research, and practice awards through her career. In fact, she has dedicated her career, which spans many decades, to supporting vulnerable and oppressed populations with a major focus on children and families involved in the child welfare and other systems, including the criminal justice system. So we're excited, we're thrilled to have Dr. Harris with so many years of experience to open this timely and necessary conversation for us. So Dr. Harris.
Thank you very much, Gordon. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to this Coalition Building for Racial Justice event. We're currently celebrating Black History Month. And I feel that it's such a privilege and an honor to have Ms. Loretta Ross with us this afternoon. As Ms. Ross is talking to us and dialoguing with us, I'd like for you to also think about Black history, the Black culture, and think about the resilience of Black culture across time, space, and hardship. But also I want you to think about the connectedness between Black communities and all our communities and culture. This year has continued to be one of much turmoil in Tacoma, Washington, and across the country. We have a lot of challenges that are facing us. Too many notable stories, and I'm not going to go into all of those. But my challenge to you today is we all need to continue to fight for our values that we believe in. We need to fight for social justice and human rights. With that said, I'd like to read our land acknowledgement. The UW-Tacoma community acknowledges that we learn, teach, work, and live on the ancestral land of the Coast Salish people in particular. Our campus is situated on traditional lands of the Puyallup tribe of Indians. We recognize this is a difficult and painful history, and we understand we must play an active role in remembering not just what happened to Indigenous communities post-settlement, but also the rich history that existed long before colonization. This land acknowledgement is one small act in an ongoing process of honoring the past while working together with local tribes to build a more inclusive and thoughtful community. Gordon?
Thank you so much, Dr. Harris, for those opening remarks. So now I will go ahead and introduce our guest speaker, Ms. Loretta Ross, for this afternoon. So Ms. Loretta Ross is an award-winning, nationally recognized expert on racism and racial justice, women's rights, and human rights. Her work emphasizes the intersectionality of social justice issues and how intersectionality can fuel transformation. Ms. Ross is a visiting associate professor at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, in the program for the study of women and gender, teaching courses on white supremacy, race and culture in America, human rights, and calling in the calling out culture. She also serves as a consultant for Smith College, collecting oral histories of feminists of color for the Sophia Smith Collection. She has written 3 books on reproductive justice. The first one, Undivided Rights, Women of Color Organized for Reproductive Justice. And this book was the winner of Outstanding Book Award by the Gustavus Myers Center for the Study of Bigotry and Human Rights. Her second book, Reproductive Justice, An Introduction, a first of its kind primer that provides a comprehensive yet succinct description of the field and puts the lives and lived experiences of women of color at the center of the book. And the third book, Racial Reproductive Justice, Foundations, Theory, Practice, Critique. Her current book, Calling in the Calling Out Culture, is forthcoming in it was published in 2021. She was a co-founder of the National Coordinator from 2005 to 2012 of the Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective, a network of women of color and allied organizations that organize women of color in the reproductive justice movement. She's a graduate of the Agnes Scott College and holds an honorary doctorate of civil law degree awarded in 2003 from the Arcadia University, and secondary honorary doctorate degree awarded from the Smith College in 2013. She is pursuing a PhD in women's studies at the Emory University in Atlanta. She's a mother, a grandmother, and a great-grandmother. So Ms. Loretta Ross, we are delighted to have you this afternoon. You now have our attention. Thank you.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be part of your Black History Month speaker series. It's always an honor to have a chance to talk to people at the University of Washington. I've done a couple of in-person events with y'all over the years, and now I get to do a virtual one. But I always enjoy my visits, even virtually, to the Pacific Northwest. I do have a PowerPoint to share with you, and since we've got a limited amount of time, I'm going to get to it so that we have sufficient time for Q&A. I would like you to make sure that you know you're going to have this Q&A time at the end. So as I'm going through my very dense presentation, what I hope that you do is pre-prepare your question so that you're prepared to ask them at the minute we go into the Q&A, if that's okay with you. I'm going to start by sharing my screen, hoping that you can see it once I display it. Can someone speak up and tell me if they can see that screen?
It's up, yes.
Okay, thank you. Let me see if I can make the controls work. I always start all my presentations with the focus on what I'm fighting for, so that I'm not only spending all my time describing what I'm fighting against. I am a proud member of the human rights movement, which I honestly must say that I didn't know that I was part of the human rights movement until the 1990s, when my boss at the time, Reverend Vivian, told me that Dr. Martin Luther King meant to build a human rights movement, not just a civil rights movement. And he made a speech to that effect on March 31st, 1968, 4 days before he was assassinated. And so I've been very proud to remind myself that Dr. King not only had a dream, he had a plan. And that plan was for us to build a human rights movement. And because I'm a feminist, I'm part of the women's rights wing of the human rights movement. But because I also care about racial justice, I'm part of the civil rights wing of the human rights movement. And I'm disabled as an elderly person. So I'm part of the disability rights wing of the human rights movement. Obviously, I don't have space to put all the arrows up there for all the issues we care about. But the point of this slide, this graphic, is to say that how we do the work is as important as the work that we do, because it means that I can't fight for women's rights in a way that's transphobic, or I can't fight for civil rights in a way that is xenophobic or against immigrants, or I can't fight for trans rights in a way that's misogynistic or against women, on and on. Because we cannot fight for human rights by violating people's human rights. And that's very important to understand, because in the midst of our call out culture foisted on us by this white supremacist system, we seem to think that it's okay to fight for our rights and anything goes as long as we win. And nothing could be further from the truth, because we dishonor the dignity of the fight when we sink to the level of our opponents, to people who are opposed to human rights. And then, as Audre Lorde famously says, trying to use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house will not win. And so, how we fight for human rights is the subject of my talk. Who we're fighting against is the white supremacist neo-fascist movement that is in the DNA of this settler colonial project called the United States of America. And our eventual victory, if we are ever going to win, has to be guided by the human rights framework. Otherwise, we will have fought and died for equal opportunity to oppress other people. And that is not why I'm in this work. I want to start with a quote from Eduardo Galeano, an Uruguayan writer, who wrote, "History never really says goodbye. History says see you later." And I follow this up with a second quote by Mosi Platt, who says that if you don't know white supremacy, everything else will confuse you. And this is why we need to study and understand about white supremacy and see how the calling out culture is such a feature of a white supremacist system. But let me start with this graphic that we all recognize, the white supremacist news that was hung up at the US Capitol in the January 6th insurrection last year. And a lot of people have said that this is a symbol of a second civil war. I would argue instead that it's the unfinished first civil war, because we never held accountable in an appropriate way those people who committed treason against the United States. Because, like, while Nazi Germany was forced to put its fascists on trial, we decided to massively pardon ours, so much so that within a few years after the Civil War, statues were being erected all around the country to rewrite the history of what actually took place, when we never really fundamentally decided what was America going to be. And it's very painful to recognize that we're at this precipice of fascism And as David Newart writes, that the road to fascism is lined with people telling us to stop overreacting because we have not yet decided whether America is going to be a country dedicated and ruled by authoritarianism or living up to the democratic promises. Unfortunately, what we're dealing with was eminently predictable. Ulysses S. Grant, who became president 4 years after Lincoln's assassination, after the Civil War, he faced numerous insurrections by Confederates from the South trying to still continue to overthrow the federal government. And he wrote, if we're to have another Civil War, I predict that the dividing line will not be Mason and Dixon's, but between patriotism and intelligence on the one side and superstition, ambition, and ignorance on the other. How prophetic are those words as we are fighting a battle between intelligence and patriotism, the defense of democracy on one side, against the forces of superstition, raw, ruthless ambition, and ignorance on the other. And he wrote those words 150 years ago. So because we have not definitively decided whether America is going to live up to its promise or stay mired in the genocide and the white supremacy that's in its DNA, is why we're still seeing ourselves as a divided country. But I would argue that it's not America is not divided, white people are divided. I find that there's a lot of unity amongst people of color by and large who are definitely in the movement towards constructing and perfecting this democracy. But there is a severe split among white people, half of whom believe that it's patriotic and intelligence to defend democracy, and half believe that it's in their best interest for permanent control to deconstruct it using superstition, ambition, and ignorance. And so this happens because we have a lot of racial illiteracy in our society. First of all, there's a conflation of white supremacy with white identity, the difference between ideology and identity. The best and the quickest way I can say that is that white supremacy is a body of ideas, and it's an ideology. Obviously, not all white people are white supremacists, and the most confounding thing that I can imagine as a person of color is to recognize that not all white supremacists are white, because we have people who manifest white supremacist thinking within our communities of color. I mean, think about Clarence Thomas, or Ben Carson, et cetera, et cetera. But the problem is that when you conflate white supremacy with the white identity, people think that we're attacking the white identity, when in fact we should be very laser focused on attacking the ideas of white supremacy, no matter who's a purveyor of those ideas. And this false attack on the identity of whiteness leads to the crazy belief that white people need to learn how to be less white, which causes a whole lot of shame and guilt for characteristics that are beyond their control. And because this is such a problematic false solution, our human rights spaces get used for public therapy to address white fragility, instead of being used to take action to build white courage as a way of repurposing that white identity as a way of fighting the ideology of white supremacy. And then we end up with this really crazy race blind kind of analysis and pretending to be so, which really reinforces this unconscious, what they call implicit bias, superiority complex, and ignores white privilege. And then within our school systems, we have this whole assumption that being apolitical, as if that's going to protect people from being politicized in a society, like the attacks on critical race theory and stuff, when in fact the curriculum is already inherently political, because it is political in that it's designed to reinforce the status quo of white dominance. And I believe that if given an opportunity to learn and practice, faculty and administrators could integrate meaningful conversations about diverse identities from the first day and throughout the entire learning process. But they can't do so if they're afraid of having the conversations. Because if they see these conversations as difficult or uncomfortable instead of manageable and joyful, then they're not going to engage in them, because we need to have fun learning new ways of being together through the fight against white supremacy. And this is because all people grow up conflicted about race, and it certainly can be internalized by people of color, what they call BIPOCs now. What we call, the belief in the colorblind neutral messaging, this whole myth that everybody has the same opportunity to work hard. Yes, everybody has an opportunity to work hard, but not everybody's going to receive the same level of benefits from working hard. And a lot of people get benefits from not working hard. So it attacks the whole concept of us actually having a meritocracy. And it's really this myth, this Horatio Alger myth, is contradicted by seeing the negative images of others that are constantly used to counter the ideas of equality, like the murder of George Floyd, for example. And then we're taught that avoiding conversations about race is best because noticing differences is rude. And then particularly young people are really work hard to hide their own differences from others, to fit in based on fear of not belonging and fear of upsetting people. And so if the people who parent young people don't know how to handle difference, then this fear of difference was transmitted. And yet when they come to our colleges, they get this abrupt, shocking awakening when they're first encountering racism without knowing how to respond to it, because quite often they're sent to our college campuses racially and in many ways sexually immature and ill prepared. And then it becomes the, the task of the college to help people, learn early adultism kind of thing. And this also deprives them of developing a richer, more rounded personality capable of dealing constructively with difference. But they already have a lot of fear of making racial errors, so that there's a lot of avoidance, denial, or even sometimes over aggressive, responsive, and defensiveness can come up. And this lack of knowledge leads to anger, guilt, resentment, and quite often inaction. I find that changing campus culture is like redirecting the Titanic fast sometimes, because there's so much fear attached to grappling with something that has been avoided so successfully for so long. I know after the murder of George Floyd that a number of my white friends talked about how afraid they were that they didn't know what they needed to know in order to rise to the occasion of the abrupt exposure of the quotidian, kind of white supremacist violence that is visited on communities of color in general and Black people in particular. They weren't prepared for it. And so I had to tell them, I know it's like having an exam tomorrow that you haven't studied for, but from the perspectives of a Black person, you had 400 years to study for this exam you're having tomorrow. Nonetheless, we're going to be there for you to help you learn. But you also need to acknowledge that if you're late to understanding what we're dealing with, that means you are not qualified to be in the leadership of deciding what we need to do. And so we end up with a lot of people affected by white privilege, but not being aware of it and being uncomfortable with the terms white supremacy and white fragility and white complacency. And then but we're all on the same team. So we all have to work together to figure out how to have these very, necessary conversations, and the conversations that actually should produce the joy of growth instead of the fear of limitations. And so we've got to get away from perceiving white supremacy as only the Ku Klux Klan, but looking at the institutionalized racism that we're having to deal with, the fact that people do feel deprived, lacking a richer, more diverse environment, or they will be made to feel shamed about who they are and what they know, because this multi-generational ignorance does produce regret, guilt, shame, longing for knowledge. And then one of the peculiar impacts of white supremacy, and particularly on white people, is the ways how much effort is spent into hiding white precarity, financial precarity. So that this whole conversation about who's appropriately white, who's white trash, who's ghetto, that kind of thing, becomes a very hard conversation to have among white people. And then I find that people who are white adjacent or white passing often disclose that there's a lot of racist conversation that takes place among white folks as long as they don't think a person of color is around. And the normalization of that and the failure to identify and challenge that is one of the ways it's continued. And, confronting white supremacy and racism directly is the healthiest response by accepting that we all have a learning curve. And there's a lot of dangers of white supremacy in 2022. First of all, we've got the precarity of democracy, a liberal democracy on the line, because there are more people, too many people, who would rather overthrow democracy than share it. And that's a real risk. And then we've got one political party that is seeking to plunge the country into a permanent state of chaos, so that the ideas of the far right always continue to dominate our politics. And they use as one of their animating myths that they're organizing against this anti-socialist, anti-communist takeover, that they're fighting communism and socialism, something we've only heard since the beginning of the 20th century in the 1919 Russian Revolution. But still, there's fear mongering. Michael Lynn calls this fourth generation warfare. I'm not going to get into it in a deep way right now, but this fear mongering is so successful as a way of getting people to risk overthrowing democracy out of their fear of socialism or communism. And then, in a very perverse reversal, they describe their critics of people who are anti-democratic as the new McCarthyism and the purveyors of the cancel culture against them. Yet we're seeing increasing hate violence and recruitment of supporters through what they call the leaderless resistance strategy. Leaderless resistance is a concept that was created by Louis Beam, who was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. In 1983, I believe he came up with this strategy because he was concerned about the ability of the FBI to send informers or plants within the Ku Klux Klan groups. And so he said, well, if we break down into leaderless cells, the small micro cells of individuals who carry out our activities, mostly violence, then even if the FBI penetrates one of our cells, they will not be able to destroy the entire organization. And because of this use of this leaderless resistance strategy is so popular, that's why when a hate crime, a mass murder takes place, the FBI, the law enforcement are so quick to say that this is a lone wolf operation. We can't find any connections, any coordination that's taking place when the evidence is hiding in plain sight. And so what we're looking at, of course, is the alignment between the far right, the religious right, the economic conservatives, the right-wing libertarians, and then the traditional bigots all coming together to create this system of chaos, to make any time a Democrat is in the presidency ungovernable, and to help maybe even create legacy dynasties like the Trump children are trying to create, or the Trump wannabes, imitators running for office. and the use of assassinations and sabotage to quash their opponents. They are openly saying that violence is as a preferred and acceptable strategy if they don't get their way, which is why you have elected officials trying to claim that the January 6th insurrection was merely a demonstration, a protest, not a violent attempt to overthrow the government, a plot, again, hiding in plain sight. And so, what the other thing that they do is try to assert that, it is the left and Islamic terrorists that are actually threatening all of these white Americans, kind of thing. And this is very reminiscent of the anti-Semitism that they used in the 1930s to blame the spread of communism on Jews. Not that communism was spreading that successfully to begin with, but to the extent it is, they cannot accept the fact that there was a successful civil rights movement that overthrew Jim Crow segregation. So they always foment these anti Semitic theories, claiming that the only reason Black people were successful in the civil rights movement is because we were being manipulated by Jewish people who are determined to manipulate and overthrow all the proper Aryan white people. You find these anti Semitic theories all through the far right, the religious right, the economic conservatives, and even to traditional bigots, which is why you see the rise, increase of hate crimes and swastikas painted on synagogues and things like this. And of course, they're challenging transformative educational event, ventures like critical race theories, coordinated assaults on colleges like Smith. I go to Smith College, and Smith has been in the crosshairs. I don't go to Smith College. I teach at Smith College. Let me get my language right. Anyway, we've been in the crosshairs of the assault for a number of years because Smith has the resources to do what a lot of colleges can't commit to, which is aggressively teach critical race theory in our campus. And as a matter of fact, I'm on a committee that is requiring a course on racial justice to become a graduation requirement at Smith. You can't graduate from Smith College soon. We're in the process of getting this through our bureaucracy, but soon, in a couple of years, you're not going to be able to graduate from Smith College without having taken a course on racial justice. And because of that, we're under a lot of attack by the New York Times and other places claiming that we're making white people feel unsafe on our own campus, which of course is predominantly white and very rich. And then we end up with a lot of trained campus provocateurs on our campus who are always trying to say that the conservative voice is under attack. Conservative students are afraid to speak up. Yeah, which is absolutely not true. And we also become subject, not only Smith, but any campus that seeks to stand up against white supremacy ends up being targeted by frivolous lawsuits aimed at draining our college resources. And so basically what we're looking at is the competition between competing values, the devaluation of democracy, which is accompanied by a lack of civics education. People are very cynical about our ability to progress towards rationality, democratic institutions, in a just society. We have these strong figures who want to manipulate people, to panic monger them so that they can scapegoat others and link white supremacy to fascism. There is an open link between the far right and the mainstream bigots who help them normalize the unthinkable, like the insurrection, like the hate crimes, like the overthrowing of democratic norms. And then there's this ostrich policy. I call it that because people are burying their heads in the sand, who should be the ones ringing the fire alarm about what's going on in the media, in the schools, for example. And it's manifested by a disdain for human rights, our domestic treaties, our global agreements, their fear of knowledge, science, and education, when in fact, that is their worst opponent. They do not want the truth to come out. They don't want people to be knowledgeable and to be educated. and then to allege that anything complicated or difficult to understand must be an elitist plot. So you end up with this collaboration with the ideas coming from the far right, the alt-right, based on biology, claiming that Aryan people or white people are the superior people and everybody else is subhuman or what they call pre-Adamic sometimes in Christian identity circles. We were the beast created before Adam was created. That's why they call it pre-Adamic. The next time you see these ideas, they're in the hands of the religious right, where instead of using a biological justification for the white supremacist ideas, they use a religious justification for the right for these white supremacist ideas by claiming that, oh, people of color by definition are sinners or Jews were the ones who killed Christ and all this other stuff that they claim, and they're the ones who are the proper conveyors of the word of God, and everybody else has to either be converted or eliminated because they're threatening the rule of God over the rest of the world. Fred Clarkson calls these the dominionists, the dominion theorist people. And then the next time you see these ideas, they're in the hands of economic conservatives. Instead of using a racial argument or a biological argument like the far right uses, or a religious argument like the religious right uses, the economic conservatives use a financial argument. So they're not going to say that Black people are biologically inferior. They're just saying that they're undeserving of the help. So they're the ones that promote the takers versus the makers rhetoric, that it is the hardworking white Americans that are building up the economy, and all these others like immigrants and Black people and trans people and all of this, they're the takers. They're trying to take away what the hardworking Americans are building. And so you get to this eliminationist theory of takers versus makers. And you hear people like Mitt Romney even, saying that, it's all about these lazy people who are trying to take away the hard work of the rest of us who have actually built this country and this economy. There is a right-wing string of the libertarians. Not all libertarians are on the right. There are left-wing libertarians as well, but for the purposes of this analysis, I'm offering a link of a perspective of the right-wing libertarians who are basically, they share with their libertarian colleagues a disdain and contempt for government, except that they don't mind an overly blown, overly large government that is directed specifically towards the management of people who they don't feel fit into the body politic. In other words, right-wing libertarians are anti-government until it comes to saying that the government should tell you who can use birth control or abortion, for example, kind of thing, or how other intrusions into our rights of privacy and stuff should be accomplished. And then the traditional institutions are the institutions that people are most likely to encounter when it comes to implementing the ideas of the far right, but they don't use biology, they don't use religion, they don't use the economy as their excuse, they just use tradition as their excuse. Well, the police force has always been white, and any effort to diversify it must be an attack on the ability of white men to get jobs kind of approach, because it's traditional for us to have this racial hierarchy. And what's wrong with that, and any attack on that must mean that we're against white people, we're against white people having jobs, and we're against white people protecting themselves. The white grievance argument that we hear Tucker Carlson running. And so again, I want to reiterate that white supremacy is an ideology. It's a certain behavior. It's not a race of people. And so what we call appropriate whiteness is a calling in strategy, because we're demanding that all people break up with white supremacy, not whiteness. And we end up with these ideologically different competing definitions of freedom. where within the white supremacist framework, you see these definitions on the left side, and then within the anti-white supremacist movement, you'll see some emerging definitions on the right. So within the white supremacist definition, they believe that there should be no control or constraints on one's actions. Is there individual freedom formation? So of course there's going to be opposition to mask wearing and vaccines, etc. And then in civic freedom, they believe that that there's supposed to be a system that guarantees the privileges of some over all others. What Charles Mills accurately calls the racial contract. If you haven't read his book, I totally recommend it. And then the sovereign freedom that they promote is having the power over other people and the exclusive use of violence. The right to use that violence, like stand your ground laws, exclusively in the hands of white people against everybody else. And so, of course, we all can witness daily how stand your ground or the right to carry an arm is not something that is afforded to people of color. Because when we try to assert those rights, we actually get assassinated for trying to point out that we may have a gun or that we're trying to stand our ground and those kinds of things. In contrast, the human rights movement was built upon the Four Freedoms movement, not built totally, but was influenced by the Four Freedoms movement articulated by former President Franklin Roosevelt, which is what he used to urge us to join World War II. I remember my father, as a soldier from World War II, had a Four Freedoms medal that was given to every soldier. And the Four Freedoms were freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Those demands for freedom that are very universal led to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 that declares that every human being has the same human rights, but all may need something different to protect them. So, for example, every child has a human right to an education, but a blind child might need her books in Braille. That's the way you use intersectionality as a way to reveal and identify the vulnerabilities you need to pay attention to in order for people to get to the same human rights that people enjoy who don't have those vulnerabilities. I don't want to sound like the white ring has everything, the white supremacist movement has everything going their way, but they have a lot of challenges. There's widespread revulsion for what they stand for by the broader society, and being open about what they want really presents a lot of dilemmas. I mean, it served Donald Trump as a tactic. I mean, a lot of people voted for him because he was an asshole white supremacist. They liked it that he was exposed as a racist, sexist, selfish person. And the more deplorable he was, the more this group revered him. This did not work for David Duke, who, when he ran for governor of Louisiana, he got 55% of the white vote in the 1990s, but he was defeated by the combination of the 45% of white voters who rejected him with the 90-something percent of people of color who rejected him. I think one of their greatest challenges is the competition among ethnically challenged people. These are not honest people. They will turn on each other for anything. When I monitored hate groups, one thing I noticed that these groups were so corrupt within, sleeping with each other's wives, stealing each other's money, setting up fake bank accounts, committing all kinds of improprieties within against each other. And that doesn't even deal with doctrinal differences, as I talk about later. And the fact that they have to use, at least in their minds, the violence and these terroristic tactics to even temporarily succeed is actually going to turn off a lot of people with their push-pull relationship with violent and nonviolent means of gaining power. And in the 20th century, we found that they were sometimes less violent when a Republican was in power, but more violent when they perceived themselves losing privileges or power. But this all changed with Donald Trump because they had a Donald Trump in power and he green-lighted them to become even more violent. But other people in power do reject them. And, I think their assaults on truth, memory, science, and evidence weaken them and strengthen us. Again, I want to reiterate the difference between blame and responsibility because no one is alive who can be blamed for the system of white supremacy, but we all bear a responsibility for ending it. We're running out of time, so I want to just go through this slide pretty quickly so I can pivot to talking about the calling in culture. When students arrive at our university, though, they're socialized into thinking that differences are scary things to talk about, and they're doing so arriving in the midst of attacks on anti-racist education, like critical race theory or attacks on affirmative action. So they don't know quite what to believe quite often because they're coming from households in which people can be very uncomfortable in talking about these issues like race, disabilities, gender, sexuality, or immigration. And somehow, a lot of parents are convinced that the best parenting is preserving childhood innocence around reality. And what this ends up doing is creating very naive, fragile, and ill-prepared students, ill-prepared to encounter and deal with differences, and they get punished for noticing difference because they're taught by being colorblind is a good thing, which is well intentioned but poorly implemented because you really can't ignore people's identity characteristics. And so you end up gaslighting your own children by insisting that they ignore what is obvious, that there are differences in people. And this actually reinforces the racial illiteracy. And it shows up in schools in very inappropriate places, like the use of the N word, like people think they should be able to get away with that kind of thing. And so it ignores the fact that children do form biases at very early ages, as young as 5 years old, if they're not directly engaged in conversations on differences, and they will act on these biases. And we need to appreciate that nobody wants to be made to feel guilty about being who they are, whether they're white, cisgender, male, disabled, person of color, black woman, or whatever. And yet, we also learn that people are taught bad strategies for coping with their mistakes early in life. Because if you make a mistake as a child and you are severely punished or shamed for making that mistake, then you are being trained into thinking that it is your obligation to punish and shame other people for making mistakes. But if when you made a mistake as a child, you were taught about what you could learn from that mistake and you were forgiven for making that mistake, you're going to be predisposed to forgive others for making a mistake. And then we end up with these fight, flight, freeze, or fawn responses that that are patterns that dictate how we respond to mistakes by others. But really, everybody's identities matter to them, especially their racial and gender identities. And we can't pretend these things don't matter just because we're uncomfortable with our inability to have these constructive, productive conversations. Yet, if we can take the risk, seeing and interacting and being friends with people who are different really helps us develop a fully complex human personality. So I've invented something called the C5 continuum, which is one of the tools I think is necessary to fight white supremacy. My class at Smith is called White Supremacy in the Age of Trump, and one of its core pedagogical foundations is embracing the calling in culture as a counter to the detrimental effects of internalized white supremacy. Now, we're all familiar with the concept of calling out, and that is publicly shaming people for something that you think that they've done wrong or is problematic, for which you think they should be held accountable. And that's what we're taught is in many ways that we're supposed to do, is to put people on blast, whether it's in real life or on social media, for things that we think they've done wrong that they should correct. Now, the ultimate calling out is canceling people. That's where you believe that not only should the person be held accountable, but they should lose a job, they should lose their platform or something else disastrous should happen to them because of the errors you think that they've made. Along the spectrum, of course, is calling in. And calling in is basically a calling out done with love. So instead of using anger, blaming, and shaming as your accountability process, you choose an accountability process that focuses on grace, forgiveness, respect, and love through calling in. And I'll be talking more about that. Calling on is an intermediate step created by Sonia Renee Taylor. And she created this step because, as she said it, she did not want to make the emotional or the intention investment into people by calling them out or calling them in. Because if you choose to call people out or in, you're giving them your time and attention. And she preferred to say, I'd rather call on them to do better without giving up my time and attention to them. And so a request to call on somebody might be a simple refusal to react to something that they've said problematic and just say, I beg your pardon. Or what did you just say? Or something like that, where you're inviting them to review what just came out of their mouths and possibly reconsider their words. And the fifth aspect of the C5 continuum is calling it off. I don't think we use that sufficiently, as frequently as we should. We have no obligation to engage in non productive conversations with people. You have a choice of whether or not you want to continue to argue with someone who doesn't want to admit a shared set of facts or evidence, or who's so busy at winning at all costs that they get into ad hominem attacks or whatever. And so you can call it off. And this doesn't matter whether it's in person or online. You can call it off permanently, basically by saying, I don't ever want to have this conversation with you again in life. Or you can call it off temporarily by saying, I'm not in a bandwidth to have this conversation right now. Can we come back at this at a time when maybe we're less emotionally charged? So calling out is basically criticizing other people's social justice practices while being not critical of one's own. It's this assumption that you know the right way to do human rights and social justice work, and everybody whose practices don't align with yours must be, by definition, wrong. I think it's often driven by people feeling unheard, disrespected, or violated, but it is always, of course, not always the best strategy. I think people a lot of times weaponize their knowledge against others. They've learned something that they didn't know before, and now they're going to judge others for what they don't know, kind of thing. It particularly happens amongst young people because it's quite amusing to watch them learn a concept in my white supremacy class and then within hours start using that learning against someone else who's not in my white supremacy class. Kind of interesting. And banishing people because they're not woke enough. I would argue that the fact that you think you're in a woke competition indicates how unwoke you actually are. Because we're not in a woke competition. There is a learning curve, it's a continuum too. And I can pretty much guarantee you that if your mind is open for new information, what you think tomorrow will not be the same thing that you thought yesterday. So how can you hold it against somebody for not being woke like you think they should be? There is so much virtue signaling happening in the call out culture where people are trying to improve their status in the community, or how woke they are, and boosting their own ego, really trying to use the movement for their personal aggrandizement. Like, being in the movement is like earning a Girl Scout badge or something. And there's this false perception that we're supposed to seek political purity of opinion. And if people don't perfectly align with our opinion of the way things should be said or perceived, then we think it's okay from our hurt positions to shame and bully people. And it's very much a truism that hurt people. But I would argue just because stuff has happened to you does not give you a right to turn around and become a victimized violator, to violate other people. Natalie Wynn is a wonderful podcaster, and I recommend that you watch her ContraPoints podcast, where she talks about the taxonomy of the 7 stages of the call out culture magnification. First of all, it starts with the presumption of guilt, not a presumption of innocence. Let's say you're at a faculty meeting and somebody named Joe says something that somebody reads as racist. Maybe Joe says something about how he couldn't get to sleep last night because there were so many gunshots in his newly gentrified neighborhood where he just bought a condo in. Well, Joe, saying what is quite an objective statement about there being a lot of gunshots in a transitional neighborhood, because that's often true, may precipitate a reaction by somebody named Nancy, who also happens to live in that transitional neighborhood. But because Nancy is Black and resents the gentrification that brought the Joes into her neighborhood, may actually read what Joe said as a microaggression or a dog whistle trying to claim that the Black neighborhood that Joe moved into is somehow more dangerous than white neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, whatever is going on. And so, in that kind of situation, Nancy is very likely to say, Joe, what you said was racist about my neighborhood. And you can only say that because you're a gentrifier or a colonizer coming into my neighborhood. Well, what happens in that situation is not a presumption of innocence, which would be the legal standard, but a presumption of guilt. Because just because Nancy has said that what Joe said was racist, there's not going to be any investigation, there's not going to be any review. Matter of fact, people are afraid to even speak up and challenge that declaration that what Joe said was racist was actually racist. So there's a presumption of guilt, and it gets so quickly abstracted and then essentialized that it goes from Joe said something was racist to Joe is a racist because it's attached now to his moral character. It becomes part of the definition of who Joe is. And then the people making such an accusation do so from a very pseudo moralistic, pseudo intellectual standpoint. I know what racism is. I get to decide who is racism. I've been hurt by racism, so da 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 da. And so they don't allow any debate over the power of definition and stuff like that, which is, again, the same thing that white supremacy does. Of course, not allowing any shared power of definition. And this is based upon a dualistic or false binary, a right, wrong, good, bad, straight, gay, whatever. All these false binaries by which people make judgments about each other. And then this takes place within a culture of unforgivability and unforgettability because poor Joe is in quite a bind because if he tries to apologize for the remarks so that he can try to get this, scarlet R off his forehead, then he's going to be seen as offering a false apology and trying to game the system. But if Joe says, I didn't say anything wrong, I just spoke about gunshots in my neighborhood, then he's going to be seen as trying to evade accountability because he didn't apologize, kind of thing. So he's damned if he does and he's damned if he doesn't, the classic catch-22. And so there's an unforgivability attached to Joe now. And of course, there's an unforgettability because wherever Joe goes on that campus, then somebody can certainly say, that's Joe, he's a racist, da 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 da. And then anybody who feels that the system is unfair, that the accusations are unfair, then suffers the risk of contamination or infection. It's as if Joe has developed political cooties. Because if you speak up and say, whoa, let's wait a moment, let's have due process, let's slow down, let's see what's actually going on, then you get accused of siding with or enabling a racist. So I invite you to look at Natalie's podcast where she describes this taxonomy in more detail. So there's a lot of symptoms to calling out where people are sized up and we determine whether they're a threat to us before we even call them out. If you notice, people don't like to call out people that they think can retaliate against them. You know, the same reason you don't go up to school bullies and call them out for fear of reprisal. Anyway, there's a lot of calling out driven by trying to seek approval from others about how woke you are. Sometimes call outs happen because you want to deflect from an issue that makes you uncomfortable. I notice that when I'm doing my trainings on white supremacy, there's always almost invariably a white male who wants to deflect to another issue. So we're talking about white supremacy, and they want to deflect about to their queer identity or to the climate change or any other topic they want to talk about that's less discomforting for them. And then there are people who are perpetually looking for a fight and they don't care how much conflict they're generating and silencing. And those are the people who I often wish, although I often can't say this publicly, but I wish for them that they would go find a therapist instead of a keyboard because they're trying to treat the movement as their personal therapy space where they're supposed to get healed, where they're supposed to be coddled and held. The purpose of the human rights movement is to end oppression, not to serve to heal any individual within the movement. Now, I found that doing the work for human rights does form part of my healing, but the other part of my healing is in my hands. What kind of help am I going to get myself for dealing with my trauma? And then we end up with another symptom is escalating the conflict to win at all costs, which is certainly a characteristic of white supremacist culture. Also, another one is dehumanizing people who don't agree with you. And then one of the things I see that erupts a lot on college campuses is the misdirection of anger towards people in power and authority who, quote, don't protect you from feeling unsafe or threatened. For example, at my college, Smith College, we had some swastikas painted on a building. Well, not only on a building, but not only on the outside of a building, but some of the swastikas were on the interior of buildings that could only be accessed by a campus key card. So obviously, the swastikas were either painted by someone who had access to a campus key card or they were enabled by somebody who had access to a campus key card. Either way, we don't know what happened. We don't know who did it, but we do know that swastikas were painted on our building. And so the president of the college wrote a letter to the campus community, of course, decrying the anti-Semitic incident, promising that we were going to investigate, and assuring us that this was not representative of the Smith community and the Smith family. Pretty standard letter that any president would write under those circumstances. But the students were in an uproar because they thought that she didn't go far enough into protecting them from the risk of white supremacists and anti-Semites on our campus. And I understand flailing against authority is fine because that's what young people do as part of the learning to be an adult process. But that was such an obvious misdirection of the outrage and the anger. And the reason it was obvious to me that they were dumping on the president unnecessarily, because what they basically were saying is that they were more angry at the president from not protecting them from anti-Semitism than they were at the possible fellow student who committed the anti-Semitism. And that's like such poor aim. I mean, I ain't got no problem with being angry, but at least be precise with your aim. And we see a lot of that outrage on college campuses where anger is turned towards people in authority for, quote, not protecting them or not making sure that no mistakes are ever made and that kind of stuff, instead of accepting that there's often a mismatch between expectations and reality, that we have this expectation that none of these harmful things will happen to us, But the reality is that there is no such thing as a safe space. The same things that are in society that are harmful are also in our campuses that are harmful. Those same things can be there. And so calling out becomes very toxic. It replicates the carceral system of punishment. It discourages people from wanting to enjoying the human rights movement. It frightens people up from telling the truth. Instead of bringing people into the movement, it drives them away by disguising our privileges and weaponizing it against, particularly our language against each other. And it makes accountability extremely difficult to achieve. When people are afraid that people are going to pounce on them for making a mistake and stuff, then they're not likely to acknowledge that they make mistakes or repair the harm that their mistakes create. And it does increase the harm rather than the healing that happens in our human rights movement in our society by devaluing people's lived experiences and isolating people, making them feel very cynical and hopeless instead of filled with joy and optimism about what we can do together. And there is a mountain out of a molehill kind of process that spirals out of control, that's disproportionate. So if somebody misgenders somebody or somebody says a word that somebody thinks is inappropriate or whatever, then it just gets blown totally out of proportion as if, you know, it's the coming of the apocalypse or something. And it does assume its own virality when done through social media. I recommend that you watch a movie that I was in called 15 Minutes of Shame that was produced by Monica Lewinsky. And it's on HBO if you'd like to watch it. And it's about how call outs can spiral totally out of control and blow up people's lives. Now, obviously, there are people who criticize the call out culture on the right. And I want to bring into this conversation a quote by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And he points out that any sober assessment of this history must conclude that the present objections to cancel culture are not so much concerned with the weapon as the kind of people who now seek to wield it. Until recently, cancellation flowed exclusively downward from the powerful to the powerless. But now, in this era, falling gatekeepers, where anyone with a Twitter handle or a Facebook account can be a publisher, banishment has been ostensibly democratized. So, yes, there are people who are critical of the call out cancel culture, but they're doing so as political cynics because they don't want to be held accountable. And we're, in fact, in the human rights movement, we promote something called democratic speech environments, where you have the right to say what you want to say, but in a democracy, you will be held accountable for what you say. Because the speech we want to encourage are the speech that foment unity, truth, evidence, democracy, not just speech that creates conflict, division, promotes falsehoods, divides people, sets people up for being targeted, sets people up for being victims. Catherine Cross calls these spear point words, where you use words designed to paint a target on a person so that they become very vulnerable and subjected to some kind of violence and stuff like that. So, yes, there is a very cynical resistance to the whole concept of the call out cancel culture on the right because they want to exclusively use it. They want to cancel critical race theory, but they don't want us to criticize their attack on trans students, for example, or their attack on immigrants, or their attack on voting rights, or all the things that they're doing as part of opposing human rights. And I think people use that call out tactic because this is what we do in the human rights movement. We tend to use call outs to address power disparities for people who are inaccessible to us. When we want to avoid increasing harm through our private means, we want to find others who are experiencing similar harms and build community with them. We want to spread information, often by identifying those invisible places where harm takes place. And we want to bring forward the voices of people who have historically been silenced, release the pent up outrage, and when public shaming worked. But I want to point out that in the human rights movement, when we use the call out culture, it's our tactic of last resort. It is not our tactic of first resort. We try other strategies first before we get to the calling out. And a lot of call outs are based on identity reductionism. I'm going over time, so I'll probably take another 5 minutes just as an alert, and then I'll stop at a quarter after the hour to leave time for Q&A. So start getting your questions ready. Identity reductionism is when you believe that a person's political opinion or action is always correct or incorrect based on their identity. And you ignore the evidence that indicates that a given opinion is harmful simply because they're a white person, a person of color, a migrant, queer, trans, or anything. In other words, you've attached meaning to their identity that trumps whatever they actually say or whatever you say. And so you find yourself hesitant to express your experience, for worry that you're not something enough. You're not Black enough, queer enough, white enough, trans enough, et cetera, et cetera. And it's born out of desire to simplify complex scenarios of conflict because of the identities of the people involved. And then when you use this kind of identity reductionism, you're usually not using a sturdy enough acknowledgement of power relations. And we call all of this identity determinism. So there are things to remember when calling in or out, is that you've got to be grounded in an understanding of power, the systems of oppression and domination. Understand it is very possible to be, as I said before, a victimized violator. That your life experiences can shape your responses and can be true, but they don't entitle you to believe that your truth is the only truth, because other people have their life experiences as well. And that white supremacy does encourage us to have these scripted, check listed lives. Check, I've done this. Check, I've done that. But life is obviously much more complicated, and we have many more choices than we think. And if we're going to counter the call out culture, we've got to focus on the conflict at hand and what is necessary to keep people in the conversation. So instead of having an over the top visceral reaction to something that we think somebody has said that is problematic, you can just say to them, I think that's an interesting point of view. Tell me more about that. With just that tell me more sentence, you've invited them into a conversation instead of a conflict. And this helps if you focus on the shared forward looking vision of human rights and what is required to achieve it. So I'm going to stop the share right there because I've run over time and invite you to consider and ask me your questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ross. Very engaging conversation presentation. We've really enjoyed every bit of it. It is such a clear, succinct articulation of where we are, why we need to do something about it, and what we can do. That's how I can summarize everything I've heard. It's very well laid out and chronologically done, so we can follow it very well. Thank you. So we have some questions that have come in, and if you don't mind, I'm going to read the first one. So the first question coming from James said, you began by discussing the difference between a human rights movement and the civil rights movement. Can you say more about that?
Oh, yeah. What I discovered once I learned about Dr. King's last Sunday sermon from March 31st, 1968, is it forced me to learn more about human rights, because for me, when I thought about human rights, I only thought about a tortured prisoner in a jail somewhere. I did not know what Dr. King was talking about. But once I started doing my research, I found out that there were 8 categories of human rights protections to which we are all entitled. There's civil rights, political rights, economic rights, social rights, cultural rights, environmental human rights, developmental human rights, and sexual human rights. And all of those rights are in close to 30 human rights treaties and conventions and covenants, and the American public doesn't even know anything about it. And so Dr. King was reduced to by the media into saying that he only fought for civil rights, which is a right to be equal to anybody in society. But he also fought for economic rights. I mean, he was marching for janitors in Memphis, when he got assassinated. He was fighting for peace and end to the Vietnam War. He was fighting, and fighting against colonialism. He was fighting against so many other things. And so I was so disappointed that the full knowledge of the human rights framework was not taught to me in school. We should have known what they taught us the Pledge of Allegiance. You couldn't teach us what our human rights were, kind of thing. And then I would argue that there's a ninth category of human rights that we need to pay attention to that I think is urgent, and that's called digital human rights. Because if you're not digitally connected, very soon you're not going to be able to access health care, education, a whole lot of things that are necessary to live a life of human dignity. And so that's what I mean. Dr. King wanted to fight for human rights, but the media wanted to reduce him to only talking about civil rights.
Thank you. I think that's a clear, succinct articulation there. And for someone, for me as a person of, from an international background, when I hear civil rights, I associate it with international relations. And then the issue of civil rights has become more associated with the struggle for Black people in this country, as opposed to situating it within the bigger context of civil rights and human rights, as you clearly described it. So thank you. The second question here, what is your approach to combating the ideas and ideologies that uphold white supremacy within BIPOC communities? So white supremacy within BIPOC communities.
Well, we are all socialized in a sea of white supremacist toxicity, and that happens globally. It's not just here in the United States. And so it takes active practices to overcome that socialization. So I'm not surprised when it shows up in our communities because we're no more immune to it than white people are. It's a choice we make to learn beyond the limits of our educational system that teaches how to fit into the system versus teaches us how to challenge the system. And so quite often you have to be intentional about seeking out information beyond what the standard school system teaches you to learn to divest yourself. For example, I'm from Texas, and in my middle school of Texas, they used to have slave auctions as a game for the students. I went to a middle school called Jefferson Davis School. He was the president of the Confederacy, I believe. And so you had these young Black kids participating in slave auctions, totally innocent because it was presented as a fun activity kind of thing. And so, my high school mascot was the Cherokees, with no acknowledgement of the genocide against Native American people. And so these are the symbols of human rights violations that are all around us. And we drank them in like we drank in, the acid rain water that we're surrounded by. So you have to be very intentional, very deliberate to seek knowledge beyond the prepackaged meals of education that we are offered. Quite often, though, what I find is that people have to have something happen to them that's out of the norm. Either, they were violated or abused as a child or got discriminated against or something like that. And that's usually the wake-up clock, the wake-up alarm that something ain't right. And that's where it turns on that curiosity thing in your brain where you want to go out and find out more. But it's very hard to overcome the brainwashing, the multi-generational brainwashing that is our society. Look at the fight over critical race theory, when we just begin to inch towards telling the truth. And then you get this violent backlash.
Thank you. We have two more questions if you have time to answer them. So the first one is, when you notice microaggression happening to someone else, how do you respond? How do you know what to do? How do you know if it will make it worse?
Well, for me, I try to adjudge the relationship between intent and impact, because a lot of microaggressions are just racial illiteracy. People will say awkward things because they don't know what the hell they're saying. I know because I've been dreading since 1980, for example. I mean, long before anybody knew about Bob Marley or Whoopi Goldberg or anybody else. So I used to get all kinds of awkward comments from both Black people and white people about my hair. And I remember this white woman walking up to me and said, "Your hair is so beautiful. Do you wash it?" And her comment took my breath away. I was like, yeah. And then, it was such a strong, aggressive microaggression that was asked, I think, in all innocence. But as I was walking away, because you know how when you walk away and that's when you realize all the wonderful things you wish you could have said in the moment, I said, I should have asked her if she washed her hair so that she could see how silly an observation that was, kind of thing. And so, but nowadays I really try to weigh intent versus impact. Because if I think you meant to harm me, then the fight is on. If I think you did it unintentionally, then I think it provides an on-ramp for us to have a conversation. So if that person said to me today, "Do you wash your hair?" I'd probably come back at them and say, "I'm glad you appreciate my hair. And can we stop and talk a minute about why you think it's, okay to assume that I don't wash my hair because it's in this style?" So I probably wouldn't overreact nowadays. I kind of call myself the white girl whisperer, because what I've learned about myself is that I can't even hate the Ku Klux Klan anymore. I learned that through deprogramming white supremacists. And when you can't hate the Klan, your hate list is very damn short. I mean, it's non-existent. So my hate list is down to intentionally mean hypocrites. Those are the people I hate still. Everybody else I tend to figure out. But I also know that that's a product of my healing. I have done very intentional and protracted work on myself with therapists within the movement, etc., so that I don't flinch because of somebody else's dysfunction. That's a boundary I've set up so that I don't hand off the remote control to my emotions to somebody else and stuff. So I don't care about microaggressions for the most part, because they're a reflection of that person. They're not a reflection of me.
That's such a fascinating response. And when you said intent versus impact, because it's one of the key tenets I give to my students in my class. So when I teach every class, we have a set of tenets that we live by, and that's one of them. Beware of intent and impact. So thank you. So one final question says, can you say more about how a power analysis could work to help us avoid identity reductionism?
Yeah. One thing I find is that we tend to make assumptions about people because the identities that they have and the power positions that they occupy. And when those things combine, when we get, for example, a white male, a white cisgendered male in a position of power, we tend to make assumptions about that person, not based on doing any actual research to find out what that person actually thinks. We just tend to make that assumption because of what their identity represents to us, and that's identity reductionism. And so I found over the years that instead of, how did this sister say? She said, we need to do more research and less me search. Identity reductionism is based on me search. Whereas I've got to deal with a white male in a position of power. I'd rather have research. I'm going to do some research to find out more about the politics of this person, the history of the person. What have they written? What have they said? That will inform my approach to them and how I will navigate and negotiate with their power and stuff. But if you walk in with the assumption because they represent a certain identity category for you, you probably are going to be ill prepared to be in a partnership or a negotiation situation with this person because you're letting your stereotype of them dictate your reaction to them. And that's why you always need a power analysis. And it's not, there are times when, well, this is where I'm probably going to get in trouble. Because I teach the class on white supremacy in the age of Trump, in my orientation, that first day of the class, where our professors do the orientation, I do a power analysis in reverse. I tell them very frankly, just because I'm a Black woman teaching about white supremacy, that does not make me your mammy. That doesn't make me the one who's going to come to you and assure you that you don't inherit or inhabit some white supremacist ideas kind of thing. So if you're looking for that kind of reassurance, it's not available here. What I'm going to do is offer you the information for you to make that determination for yourself. Because I'm not going to give you reassurance that you're a great white person. That ain't going to happen. Or that you're a great Black person for that matter. That ain't going to happen. But I will give you all the support necessary for you to make that decision and to do that growth yourself.
Well, this is the final question. So we'd like to thank you so much, Ms. Ross, for this fascinating conversation. I wrote down so many what I call sound bites as I was listening to you. And one of them that I'm taking with me is that this quote, trying to use the master's tool won't work.
Right.
And,
well, Audrey said it. Audrey was a friend of mine, and she said it first. And whenever you need a really pithy quote, there's few people are better than Audrey Lorde.
So that's one of the things that I really appreciate, and how you clearly laid out the distinction between white supremacy and white identity. Then we also appreciate all the tools that you laid out, including the recommendations and the resources that you offered. Now, I just want to ask you this one last thing. Do you have maybe a set of resources, say organizations, books, recommendations that perhaps you could give to the Office of Inclusion that you could share with those who attended or the campus community about advancing this work? That's just from me.
Well, I do have a white supremacy syllabus that I can make available, but and you can write me and get it. But I offer these calling in classes online for $5 a lesson, and you get a package of 6 of them for $30, right? Which is 6 weeks of calling in lessons and stuff. So I think it's like the most, bargain friendly kind of way to get some higher consciousness on this stuff. I don't have an ongoing class right now going on because I'm in the throes of finishing up my calling in book, which is due in April. But every month I host a national conversation on the calling in culture. We just finished one last night, unfortunately, but our next one is March 28th. And so you go to my website, lorettajross.com, and you sign up for joining the national calling in conversation. How can we create a calling in culture kind of thing? And the theme of the next conversation is perfectionism and how it harms our ability to work together and stuff. But you can sign up to get on my mailing list and get notification about the classes through my website. And that's where you can send me an email to request my white supremacy syllabus.
Okay, perfect. So once again, we want to thank you so much for that presentation, for answering the questions. And for those who attended, we'd like to thank you so much on behalf of the Office of Equity and Inclusion for attending this event today. Thank you.
Thank y'all. Bye-bye.
Bye.